Do you really think the world around you is perfectly safe? Perhaps the person right next to you is hiding a dark truth. New Moon on our channel, we uncover bone-chilling crimes and psychological thrillers that you've never heard before. To dive into the depths of mystery, subscribe now, and if you enjoy the video, stay with us by leaving a like. Remember, the truth isn't always right in front of your eyes.
Chapter 4, Part 1 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. South. The story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 4, Part 1. Loss of the Endurance. The ice did not trouble us again seriously until the end of September, though during the whole month the floe was seldom entirely without movement. The roar of pressure would come to us across the otherwise silent ice fields, and bring with it a threat and a warning. Watching from the crow's nest, we could see sometimes the formation of pressure ridges. The sunshine glittered on newly riven ice surfaces, as the masses of shattered floe rose and fell away from the line of pressure. The area of disturbance would advance towards us, recede, and advance again. The routine of work and play on the Endurance proceeded steadily. Our plans and preparations for any contingency that might arise during the approaching summer had been made, but there seemed always plenty to do in and about our prisoned ship. Runs with the dogs and vigorous games of hockey and football on the rough snow-covered floe kept all hands in good fettle. The record of one or two of these September days will indicate the nature of our life and our surroundings. September 4th. Temperature -14.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Light easterly breeze, blue sky and stratus clouds. During forenoon notice a distinct terracotta or biscuit colour in the stratus clouds to the north. This travelled from east to west and could conceivably have come from some of the Graham Land volcanoes, now about 300 miles distant to the northwest. The upper current of air probably would come from that direction. Heavy rime. Pack unbroken and unchanged as far as visible. No land for 22 miles. No animal life observed. September 7th. Temperature -10.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Moderate easterly to southerly winds, overcast and misty, with light snow till midnight, when weather cleared. Blue sky and fine clear weather to noon. Much rim aloft. Thick fresh snow on ship and floe that glistens brilliantly in the morning sunlight. Little clouds of faint violet-coloured mist rise from the lower and brinier portions of the pack, which stretches unbroken to the horizon. Very great refraction all around. A tabular berg, about 50 feet high, 10 miles west, is a good index of the amount of refraction. On ordinary days it shows from the masthead, clear-cut against the sky, with much refraction. The pack beyond, at the back of it, lifts up into view. Today a broad expanse of miles of pack is seen above it. Numerous other bergs generally seen in silhouette are, at first sight, lost, but after a closer scrutiny they appear as large lumps or dark masses well below the horizon. Refraction generally results in too big an altitude when observing the sun for position, but today the horizon is thrown up so much that the altitude is about 12 minutes too small. No land visible for 20 miles. No animal life observed. Lower Clark's tow net, with 566 fathoms of wire, and hoisted up at 2.5 miles an hour by walking along the floe with the wire. Result rather meagre. Jellyfish and some fish larvae. Exercise dogs and sledge teams. The young dogs, under Crean's care, pull as well, though not as strongly, as the best team in the pack. Hercules, for the last fortnight or more, has constituted himself leader of the orchestra. 2 or 3 times in the 24 hours he starts a howl, a deep, melodious howl, and in about 30 seconds he has the whole pack in full song, the great deep, booming, harmonious song of the half-wolf pack. By the middle of September we were running short on fresh meat for the dogs. The seals and penguins seemed to have abandoned our neighbourhood altogether. Nearly 5 months had passed since we killed a seal, and penguins had been seen seldom. Clark, who was using his trawl as often as possible, reported that there was a marked absence of plankton in the sea, and we assumed that the seals and the penguins had gone in search of their accustomed food. The men got an emperor on the 23rd. The dogs, which were having their sledging exercise, became wildly excited when the penguin, which had risen in a crack, was driven ashore, and the best efforts of the drivers failed to save it alive. On the following day, Wild, Hurley, Macklin and McIlroy took their teams to the Stained Berg, about 7 miles west of the ship, and on their way back got a female crab-eater, which they killed, skinned, and left to be picked up later. They ascended to the top of the berg, which lay in about latitude 69 degrees 30 minutes south, longitude 51 degrees west, and from an elevation of 110 feet could see no land. Samples of the discoloured ice from the berg proved to contain dust with black gritty particles or sand grains. Another seal, a bull Weddell, was secured on the 26th. The return of seal life was opportune, since we had nearly finished the winter supply of dog biscuit, and wished to be able to feed the dogs on meat. The seals meant a supply of blubber, moreover, to supplement our small remaining stock of coal, when the time came to get up steam again. We initiated a daylight saving system on this day by putting forward the clock 1 hour. This is really pandering to the base but universal passion that men, and especially seafarers, have for getting up late. Otherwise we would be honest and make our routine earlier instead of flogging the clock. During the concluding days of September, the roar of the pressure grew louder, and I could see that the area of disturbance was rapidly approaching the ship. Stupendous forces were at work, and the fields of firm ice around the Endurance were being diminished steadily. September 30th was a bad day. It began well, for we got 2 penguins and 5 seals during the morning. 3 other seals were seen. But at 3 p.m, cracks that had opened during the night alongside the ship commenced to work in a lateral direction. The ship sustained terrific pressure on the port side forward, the heaviest shocks being under the fore-rigging. It was the worst squeeze we had experienced. The decks shuddered and jumped, beams arched, and stanchions buckled and shook. I ordered all hands to stand by in readiness for whatever emergency might arise. Even the dogs seemed to feel the tense anxiety of the moment. But the ship resisted valiantly, and just when it appeared that the limit of her strength was reached, the huge floe that was pressing down upon us cracked across and so gave relief. "The behaviour of our ship in the ice has been magnificent," wrote Worsley. "Since we have been beset, her staunchness and endurance have been almost past belief again and again. She has been nipped with a 1,000,000-ton pressure and risen nobly, falling clear of the water out on the ice. She has been thrown to and fro, like a shuttlecock, a dozen times. She has been strained, her beams arched upwards, by the fearful pressure. Her very sides opened and closed again as she was actually bent and curved along her length, groaning like a living thing. It will be sad if such a brave little craft should be finally crushed in the remorseless, slowly strangling grip of the Weddell pack, after 10 months of the bravest and most gallant fight ever put up by a ship. The Endurance deserved all that could be said in praise of her. Shipwrights had never done sounder or better work. But how long could she continue to fight under such conditions? We were drifting into the congested area of the Western Weddell Sea, the worst portion of the worst sea in the world, where the pack, forced on irresistibly by wind and current, impinges on the western shore and is driven up in huge corrugated ridges and chaotic fields of pressure. The vital question for us was whether or not the ice would open sufficiently to release us, or at least give us a chance of release, before the drift carried us into the most dangerous area. There was no answer to be got from the silent bergs and the grinding floes, and we faced the month of October with anxious hearts. The leads in the pack appeared to have opened up a little on October 1st, but not sufficiently to be workable, even if we had been able to release the Endurance from the floe. The day was calm, cloudy and misty in the forenoon, and clearer in the afternoon, when we observed well-defined parhelia. The ship was subjected to slight pressure at intervals. 2 bull crab-eaters climbed onto the floe close to the ship, and were shot by Wild. They were both big animals in prime condition, and I felt that there was no more need for anxiety as to the supply of fresh meat for the dogs. Seal liver made a welcome change in our own menu. The 2 bulls were marked, like many of their kind, with long parallel scars about 3 inches apart, evidently the work of the killers. A bull we killed on the following day had 4 parallel scars, 16 inches long, on each side of its body. They were fairly deep, and one flipper had been nearly torn away. The creature must have escaped from the jaws of a killer by a very small margin. Evidently life beneath the pack is not always monotonous. We noticed that several of the bergs in the neighbourhood of the ship were changing their relative positions more than they had done for months past. The floes were moving. Our position on Sunday, October 3rd, was latitude 69 degrees, 14 minutes south, longitude 51 degrees, 8 minutes west. During the night, the floe holding the ship aft cracked in several places, and this appeared to have eased the strain on the rudder. The forenoon was misty, with falls of snow, but the weather cleared later in the day, and we could see that the pack was breaking. New leads had appeared, while several old leads had closed. Pressure ridges had risen along some of the cracks. The thickness of the season's ice, now about 230 days old, was 4 foot 5 inches, under 7 or 8 inches of snow. The ice had been slightly thicker in the early part of September, and I assumed that some melting had begun below. Clark had recorded plus temperatures at depths of 150 and 200 fathoms in the concluding days of September. The ice obviously had attained its maximum thickness by direct freezing, and the heavier older floes had been created by the consolidation of pressure ice and the overlapping of floes under strain. The air temperatures were still low, minus 24.5 degrees Fahrenheit, being recorded on October 4th. The movement of the ice was increasing. Frost smoke from opening cracks was showing in all directions during October 6th. It had the appearance in one place of a great prairie fire, rising from the surface and getting higher as it drifted off before the wind in heavy, dark, rolling masses. At another point, there was the appearance of a train running before the wind, the smoke rising from the locomotive straight upwards, and the smoke columns elsewhere gave the effects of warships steaming in line ahead. During the following day, the leads and cracks opened to such an extent that if the Endurance could have been forced forward for 30 yards, we could have proceeded for 2 or 3 miles. But the effort did not promise any really useful result. The conditions did not change materially during the rest of that week. The position on Sunday, October 10th, was latitude 69 degrees, 21 minutes south, longitude 50 degrees, 34 minutes west. A thaw made things uncomfortable for us that day. The temperature had risen from minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit to plus 29.8 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest we had experienced since January, and the ship got dripping wet between decks. The upper deck was clear of ice and snow, and their cabins became unpleasantly messy. The dogs, who hated wet, had a most unhappy air. Undoubtedly one grows to like familiar conditions. We had lived long in temperatures that would have seemed distressingly low in civilized life, and now we were made uncomfortable by a degree of warmth that would have left the unaccustomed human being still shivering. The thaw was an indication that winter was over, and we began preparations for reoccupying the cabins on the main deck. I had the shelter house round the stern pulled down on the 11th, and made other preparations for working the ship as soon as she got clear. The carpenter had built a wheelhouse over the wheel aft as shelter in cold and heavy weather. The ice was still loosening, and no land was visible for 20 miles. The temperature remained relatively high for several days. All hands moved to their summer quarters in the upper cabins on the 12th, to the accompaniment of much noise and laughter. Spring was in the air, and if there were no green growing things to gladden our eyes, there were at least many seals, penguins, and even whales disporting themselves in the leads. The time for renewed action was coming, and though our situation was grave enough, we were facing the future hopefully. The dogs were kept in a state of uproar by the sight of so much game. They became almost frenzied when a solemn-looking emperor penguin inspected them gravely from some point of vantage on the floe, and gave utterance to an apparently derisive "Nonk!" At 7 p.m. on the 13th, the ship broke free of the floe, on which she had rested to starboard sufficiently to come upright. The rudder freed itself, but the propeller was found to be athwartship, having been forced into that position by the floe some time after August 1st. The water was very clear, and we could see the rudder, which appeared to have suffered only a slight twist to port at the waterline. It moved quite freely. The propeller, as far as we could see, was intact, but it could not be moved by the hand gear, probably owing to a film of ice in the stern gland and sleeve. I did not think it advisable to attempt to deal with it at this stage. The ship had not been pumped for 8 months, but there was no water, and not much ice in the bilges. Meals were served again in the wardroom that day. The southwesterly breeze freshened to a gale on the 14th, and the temperature fell from +31° Fahrenheit to -1° Fahrenheit. At midnight the ship came free from the floe and drifted rapidly astern. Her head fell off before the wind until she lay nearly at right angles across the narrow lead. This was a dangerous position for rudder and propeller. The spanker was set, but the weight of the wind on the ship gradually forced the floes open, until the Endurance swung right round and drove 100 yards along the lead. Then the ice closed, and at 3 a.m. we were fast again. The wind died down during the day, and the pack opened for 5 or 6 miles to the north. It was still loose on the following morning, and I had the boiler pumped with the intention of attempting to clear the propeller. But one of the manholes developed a leak, the packing being perished by cold or loosened by contraction, and the boiler had to be emptied out again. The pack was rather closer on Sunday the 17th. Topsails and headsails were set in the afternoon, and with a moderate northeasterly breeze we tried to force the ship ahead out of the lead, but she was held fast. Later that day heavy pressure developed. The 2 floes between which the Endurance was lying began to close, and the ship was subjected to a series of tremendously heavy strains. In the engine room, the weakest point, loud groans, crashes, and hammering sounds were heard. The iron plates on the floor buckled up and overrode with loud clangs. Meanwhile the floes were grinding off each other's projecting points and throwing up pressure ridges. The ship stood the strain well for nearly an hour, and then, to my great relief, began to rise with heavy jerks and jars. She lifted 10 inches forward, and then 3 foot 4 inches aft, at the same time heeling 6 degrees to port. The ice was getting below us, and the immediate danger had passed. The position was latitude 69 degrees, 19 minutes south, longitude 50 degrees, 40 minutes west. The next attack of the ice came on the afternoon of October 18th. The two floes began to move laterally, exerting great pressure on the ship. Suddenly the floe on the port side cracked, and huge pieces of ice shot up from under the port bilge. Within a few seconds the ship heeled over, until she had a list of 30 degrees to port, being held under the starboard bilge by the opposing floe. The lee boats were now almost resting on the floe. The midship dog kennels broke away and crashed down onto the lee kennels, and the howls and barks of the frightened dogs assisted to create a perfect pandemonium. Everything movable on deck and below fell to the lee side, and for a few minutes it looked as if the Endurance would be thrown upon her beam ends. Order was soon restored. I had all fires put out, and battens nailed on the deck to give the dogs a foothold and enable people to get about. Then the crew lashed all the movable gear. If the ship had heeled any farther, it would have been necessary to release the lee boats and pull them clear, and Worsley was watching to give the alarm. Hurley meanwhile descended to the floe and took some photographs of the ship in her unusual position. Dinner in the wardroom that evening was a curious affair. Most of the diners had to sit on the deck, their feet against battens and their plates on their knees. At 8 p.m. the floes opened, and within a few minutes the Endurance was nearly upright again. Orders were given for the ice to be chipped clear of the rudder. The men poled the blocks out of the way, when they had been detached from the floe with the long ice chisels, and we were able to haul the ship's stern into a clear berth. Then the boiler was pumped up. This work was completed early in the morning of October 19th, and during that day the engineer lit fires and got up steam very slowly, in order to economise fuel and avoid any strain on the chilled boilers by unequal heating. The crew cut up all loose lumber, boxes, etc., and put them in the bunkers for fuel. The day was overcast, with occasional snowfalls, the temperature plus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The ice in our neighbourhood was quiet, but in the distance pressure was at work. The wind freshened in the evening, and we ran a wire mooring astern. The barometer at 11 p.m. stood at 28.96, the lowest since the gales of July. An uproar among the dogs attracted attention late in the afternoon, and we found a 25-foot whale cruising up and down in our pool. It pushed its head up once in characteristic killer fashion, but we judged from its small curved dorsal fin that it was a specimen of Balaenoptera acotora strata, not Orca gladiator. A strong southwesterly wind was blowing on October 20th, and the pack was working. The Endurance was imprisoned securely in the pool, but our chance might come at any time. Watches were set so as to be ready for working ship. Wild and Hudson, Greenstreet and Cheetham, Worsley and Crean took the deck watches, and the chief engineer and second engineer kept watch, and watched with 3 of the ABs for stokers. The staff and the forward hands, with the exception of the cook, the carpenter and his mate, were on watch and watch, that is, 4 hours on deck and 4 hours below or off duty. The carpenter was busy making a light punt, which might prove useful in the navigation of lanes and channels. At 11 a.m. we gave the engines a gentle trial turn astern. Everything worked well after 8 months of frozen inactivity, except that the bilge pump and the discharge proved to be frozen up. They were cleared with some little difficulty. The engineer reported that to get steam he had to use 1 ton of coal, with wood ashes and blubber. The fires, required to keep the boiler warm, consumed 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 hundredweight of coal per day. We had about 50 tons of coal remaining in the bunkers. October 21st and 22nd were days of low temperature, which caused the open leads to freeze over. The pack was working, and ever and anon the roar of pressure came to our ears. We waited for the next move of the gigantic forces arrayed against us. The 23rd brought a strong northwesterly wind, and the movement of the floes and pressure ridges became more formidable. Then, on Sunday, October 24th, there came what, for the Endurance, was the beginning of the end. The position was latitude 69 degrees 11 minutes south, longitude 51 degrees 5 minutes west. We had now 22.5 hours of daylight, and throughout the day we watched the threatening advance of the floes. At 6:45 p.m. the ship sustained heavy pressure in a dangerous position. The attack of the ice is illustrated roughly in the appended diagram. The shaded portions represent the pool, covered with new ice, that afforded no support to the ship, and the arrows indicate the direction of the pressure exercised by the thick floes and pressure ridges. The onslaught was all but irresistible. The Endurance groaned and quivered as her starboard quarter was forced against the floe, twisting the stern post and starting the heads and ends of planking. The ice had lateral as well as forward movement, and the ship was twisted and actually bent by the stresses. She began to leak dangerously at once. I had the pumps rigged, got up steam, and started the bilge pumps at 8 p.m. The pressure by that time had relaxed. The ship was making water rapidly aft, and the carpenter set to work to make a coffer dam astern of the engines. All hands worked, watch and watch, throughout the night, pumping ship and helping the carpenter. By morning the leak was being kept in check. The carpenter and his assistants chalked the cofferdam with straps of blankets, and nailed strips over the seams wherever possible. The main or hand pump was frozen up, and could not be used at once. After it had been knocked out, Worsley, Greenstreet, and Hudson went down in the bunkers and cleared the ice from the bilges. "This is not a pleasant job," wrote Worsley. "We have to dig a hole down through the coal, while the beams and timbers groan and creak all around us like pistol shots. The darkness is almost complete, and we mess about in the wet with half-frozen hands, and try to keep the coal from slipping back into the bilges. The men on deck pour buckets of boiling water from the galley down the pipe as we prod and hammer from below, and at last we get the pump clear, cover up the bilges to keep the coal out, and rush on deck, very thankful to find ourselves safe in the open air." Monday, October 25th dawned, cloud and misty, with a minus temperature and a strong southeasterly breeze. All hands were pumping at intervals, and assisting the carpenter with the cofferdam. The leak was being kept under fairly easily, but the outlook was bad. Heavy pressure ridges were forming in all directions, and though the immediate pressure upon the ship was not severe, I realised that the respite would not be prolonged. The pack within our range of vision was being subjugated to enormous compression, such as might be caused by cyclonic winds, opposing ocean currents, or constriction in a channel of some description. I realised that the respite would not be prolonged. The pressure ridges, massive and threatening, testified to the overwhelming nature of the forces that were at work. Huge blocks of ice weighing many tons were lifted into the air and tossed aside as other masses rose beneath them. We were helpless, intruders in a strange world. Our lives depended upon the play of grim elementary forces that made a mockery of our puny efforts. I scarcely dared hope now that the Endurance would live, and throughout that anxious day I reviewed again the plans made long before the sledging journey that we must make in the event of our having to take to the ice. We were ready, as far as forethought could make us, for every contingency. Stores, dogs, sledges, and equipment were ready to be moved from the ship at a moment's notice. The following day brought clear weather with a blue sky. The The sunshine was inspiriting. The roar of pressure could be heard all around us. New ridges were rising, and I could see as the day wore on that the lines of major disturbance were drawing nearer to the ship. The Endurance suffered some strains at intervals. Listening below, I could hear the cracking and groaning of her timbers, the pistol-like cracks that told of the starting of a trenail or plank, and the faint, indefinable whispers of our ship's distress. Overhead the sun shone serenely. Occasional fleecy clouds drifted before the southerly breeze, and the light glinted and sparkled on the million facets of the new pressure ridges. The day passed slowly. At 7 p.m. very heavy pressure developed, with twisting strains that racked the ship fore and aft. The butts of planking were opened 4 and 5 inches on the starboard side, and at the same time we could see from the bridge that the ship was bending like a bow under titanic pressure. Almost like a living creature, she resisted the forces that would crush her. But it was a one-sided battle. Millions of tons of ice pressed inexorably upon the little ship that had dared the challenge of the Antarctic. The Endurance was now leaking badly, and at 9 p.m. I gave the order to lower boats, gear, provisions, and sledges to the floe, and move them to the flat ice a little way from the ship. The working of the ice closed the leak slightly at midnight, but all hands were pumping all night. A strange occurrence was the sudden appearance of 8 emperor penguins from a crack 100 yards away, at the moment when the pressure upon the ship was at its climax. They walked a little way towards us, halted, and after a few ordinary calls, proceeded to utter wild cries that sounded like a dirge for the ship. None of us had ever before heard the emperors utter any other than the most simple calls or cries, and the effect of this concerted effort was almost startling. End of Chapter 4, Part 1. Chapter 4, Part 2 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. South. The story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 4, Part 2. The loss of the Endurance. Then came a fateful day, Wednesday, October 27th. The position was latitude 69 degrees, 5 minutes south, longitude 51 degrees, 30 minutes west. The temperature was minus 8.5 degrees Fahrenheit. A gentle southerly breeze was blowing, and the sun shone in a clear sky. After long months of ceaseless anxiety and strain, after times when hope beat high and times when the outlook was black indeed, the end of the Endurance has come. But though we have been compelled to abandon the ship, which is crushed beyond all hope of ever being righted, we are alive and well, and we have stores and equipment for the task that lies before us. The task is to reach land with all the members of the expedition. It is hard to write what I feel. To a sailor his ship is more than a floating home, and in the Endurance I had centred ambitions, hopes, and desires. Now, straining and groaning, her timbers creaking and her wounds gaping, she is slowly giving up her sentient life at the very outset of her career. She is crushed and abandoned after drifting more than 570 miles in a northwesterly direction during the 281 days since she became locked in the ice. The distance from the point where she became beset to the place where she now rests, mortally hurt in the grip of the floe, is 573 miles. But the total drift through all observed positions has been 1,186 miles. and probably we actually covered more than 1,500 miles. We are now 346 miles from Paulet Island, the nearest point where there is any possibility of finding food and shelter. A small hut, built there by the Swedish expedition in 1902, is filled with stores left by the Argentine relief ship. I know all about those stores, for I purchased them in London on behalf of the Argentine government, when they asked me to equip the relief expedition. The distance to the nearest barrier west of us is about 180 miles, but a party going there would still be about 360 miles from Paulet Island, and there would be no means of sustaining life on the barrier. We could not take from here food enough for the whole journey. The weight would be too great. This morning, our last on the ship, the weather was clear, with a gentle south-southeasterly to south-southwesterly breeze. From the crow's nest there was no sign of land of any sort. The pressure was increasing steadily, and the passing hours brought no relief or respite for the ship. The attack of the ice reached its climax at 4 p.m. The ship was hove stern up by the pressure, and the driving floe, moving laterally across the stern, split the rudder and tore out the rudder post and stern post. Then, while we watched, the ice loosened and the Endurance sank a little. The decks were breaking upwards, and the water was pouring in below. Again the pressure began, and at 5 p.m. I ordered all hands on to the ice. The twisting, grinding floes were working their will at last on the ship. It was a sickening sensation to feel the decks breaking up under one's feet, the great beams bending and then snapping with a noise like heavy gunfire. The water was overmastering the pumps, and to avoid an explosion when it reached the boilers, I had to give orders for the fires to be drawn and the steam let down. The plans for abandoning the ship in case of emergency had been made well in advance, and men and dogs descended to the floe and made their way to the comparative safety of an unbroken portion of the floe without a hitch. Just before leaving I looked down the engine room skylight as I stood on the quivering deck, and saw the engines dropping sideways as the stays and bed plates gave way. I cannot describe the impression of relentless destruction that was forced upon me as I looked down and around. The floes, with the force of millions of tons of moving ice behind them, were simply annihilating the ship. Essential supplies had been placed on the floe about 100 yards from the ship, and there we set about making a camp for the night. But about 7 p.m., after the tents were up, the ice we were occupying became involved in the pressure and started to split and smash beneath our feet. I had the camp moved to a bigger floe about 200 yards away, just beyond the bow of the ship. Boats, stores, and camp equipment had to be conveyed across a working pressure ridge. The movement of the ice was so slow that it did not interfere much with our short trek, but the weight of the ridge had caused the floes to sink on either side, and there were pools of water there. A pioneer party with picks and shovels had to build a snow causeway before we could get all our possessions across. By 8 p.m. the camp had been pitched again. We had 2 pole tents and 3 hoop tents. I took charge of the small pole tent, number 1, with Hudson, Hurley and James as companions. Wild had the small hoop tent, number 2, with Wordie, McNeish and McIlroy. These hoop tents were very easily shifted and set up. The 8 forward hands had the large hoop tent, number 3. Crean had charge of number 4 hoop tent, with Hussey, Marston and Cheetham, and Worsley had the other pole tent, number 5, with Greenstreet, Lees, Clark, Kerr, Rickenson, Macklin and Blackborough, the last name being the youngest of the forward hands. Tonight the temperature has dropped to -16°F, and most of the men are cold and uncomfortable. After the tents had been pitched, I mustered all hands and explained the position to them briefly, and I hope clearly. I have told them the distance to the barrier, and the distance to Paulet Island. and have stated that I propose to try to march with equipment across the ice in the direction of Paulet Island. I thanked the men for the steadiness and good morale they have shown in these trying circumstances, and told them I had no doubt that, provided they continue to work their utmost and to trust me, we will all reach safety in the end. Then we had supper, which the cook had prepared at the big blubber stove, and after a watch had been set, all hands, except the watch, turned in. For myself, I could not sleep. The destruction and abandonment of the ship was no sudden shock. The disaster had been looming ahead for many months, and I had studied my plans for all contingencies 100 times. But the thoughts that came to me as I walked up and down in the darkness were not particularly cheerful. The task now was to secure the safety of the party, and to that I must bend my energies and mental power and apply every bit of knowledge that experience of the Antarctic had given me. The task was likely to be long and strenuous, and an ordered mind and a clear programme were essential if we were to come through without loss of life. A man must shape himself to a new mark directly the old one goes to ground. At midnight I was pacing the ice, listening to the grinding floe and to the groans and crashes that told of the death agony of the Endurance, when I noticed a sudden crack running across our floe right through the camp. The alarm whistle brought all hands tumbling out, and we moved the tents and stores lying on what was now the smaller portion of the floe to the larger portion. Nothing more could be done at that moment, and the men turned in again, but there was little sleep. Each time I came to the end of my beat on the floe, I could just see in the darkness the unpeering piles of pressure ice, which toppled over and narrowed still further the little floating island we occupied. I did not notice at the time that my tent, which had been on the wrong side of the crack, had not been erected again. Hudson and James had managed to squeeze themselves into other tents, and Hurley had wrapped himself in the canvas of number 1 tent. I discovered this about 5 a.m. All night long the electric light gleamed from the stern of the dying Endurance. Hussey had left this light switched on when he took a last observation, and, like a lamp in a cottage window, it braved the night until, in the early morning, the Endurance received a particularly violent squeeze. There was a sound of rending beams, and the light disappeared. The connection had been cut. Morning came in, chill and cheerless. All hands were stiff and weary after their first disturbed night on the floe. Just at daybreak I went over to the Endurance with Wild and Hurley, in order to retrieve some tins of petrol that could be used to boil up milk for the rest of the men. The ship presented a painful spectacle of chaos and wreck. The jib boom and bowsprit had snapped off during the night, and now lay at right angles to the ship, with the chains, martingale, and bobstay dragging them as the vessel quivered and moved in the grinding pack. The ice had driven over the forecastle, and she was well down by the head. We secured 2 tins of petrol with some difficulty, and postponed the further examination of the ship until after breakfast. Jumping across cracks with the tins, we soon reached camp, and built a fireplace out of the triangular watertight tanks we had ripped from the lifeboat. This was done in order to make more room. Then we pierced a petrol tin in 6 places with an ice axe and set fire to it. The petrol blazed fiercely under the 5-gallon drum we used as a cooker, and the hot milk was ready in quick time. Then we 3 ministering angels went round the tents with a life-giving drink, and were surprised, and a trifle chagrined, at the matter-of-fact manner in which some of the men accepted this contribution to their comfort. They did not quite understand what work we had done for them in the early dawn, and I heard Wild say, "If any of you gentlemen would like your boots cleaned, just put them outside." This was his gentle way of reminding them that a little thanks will go a long way on such occasions. The cook prepared breakfast, which consisted of biscuit and hoosh at 8 a.m, and I then went over to the Endurance again and made a fuller examination of the wreck. Only 6 of the cabins had not been pierced by floes and blocks of ice. Every one of the starboard cabins had been crushed. The whole of the after part of the ship had been crushed concertina fashion. The forecastle and the Ritz were submerged, and the wardroom was 3/4 full of ice. The starboard side of the wardroom had come away. The motor engine forward had been driven through the galley. Petrol cases that had been stacked on the foredeck had been driven by the flow through the wall into the wardroom, and had carried before them a large picture. Curiously enough, the glass of this picture had not been cracked, whereas in the immediate neighbourhood I saw heavy iron davits that had been twisted and bent like the ironwork of a wrecked train. The ship was being crushed remorselessly. Under a dull, overcast sky, I returned to camp and examined our situation. The floe occupied by the camp was still subject to pressure, and I thought it wise to move to a larger and apparently stronger floe about 200 yards away, off the starboard bow of the ship. This camp was to become known as Dump Camp, owing to the amount of stuff that was thrown away there. We could not afford to carry unnecessary gear, and a drastic sorting of equipment took place. I decided to issue a complete new set of Burberrys and underclothing to each man, and also a supply of new socks. The camp was transferred to the larger floe quickly, and we began there to direct preparations for the long journey across the floes to Paulet Island or Snow Hill. Hurley meanwhile had rigged his cinematograph camera and was getting pictures of the Endurance in her death throes. While he was engaged thus, the ice, driving against the standing rigging and the foremain and mizzenmasts, snapped the shrouds. The foretop and topgallant mast came down with a run, and hung in wreckage on the foremast, with the fore-yard vertical. The mainmast followed immediately, snapping off about 10 feet above the main deck. The crow's nest fell within 10 feet of where Hurley stood, turning the handle of his camera, but he did not stop the machine, and so secured a unique though sad picture. The issue of clothing was quickly accomplished. Sleeping bags were required also. We had 18 fur bags, and it was necessary, therefore, to issue 10 of the Jaeger woolen bags in order to provide for the 28 men of the party. The woolen bags were lighter and less warm than the reindeer bags, and so each man who received one of them was allowed also a reindeer skin to lie upon. It seemed fair to distribute the fur bags by lot, but some of us older hands did not join in the lottery. We thought we could do quite as well with the Jaegers as with the furs. With quick dispatch the clothing was apportioned, and then we turned one of the boats on its side, and supported it with 2 broken oars to make a lee for the galley. The cook got the blubber stove going, and a little later, when I was sitting round the corner of the stove, I heard one man say, "Cook, I like my tea strong." Another joined in, "Cook, I like mine weak." It was pleasant to know that their minds were untroubled, but I thought the time opportune to mention that the tea would be the same for all hands, and that we would be fortunate if 2 months later we had any tea at all. It occurred to me at the time that the incident had psychological interest. Here were men, their home crushed, the camp pitched on the unstable floes, and their chance of reaching safety apparently remote, calmly attending to the details of existence, and giving their attention to such trifles as the strength of a brew of tea. During the afternoon the work continued. Every now and then we heard a noise like heavy guns or distant thunder, caused by the floes grinding together. The pressure caused by the congestion in this area of the pack is producing a scene of absolute chaos. The floes grind stupendously, throw up great ridges, and shatter one another mercilessly. The ridges, or hedgerows, marking the pressure lines that border the fast diminishing pieces of smooth floe ice, are enormous. The ice moves majestically, irresistibly. Human effort is not futile, but man fights against the giant forces of nature in a spirit of humility. One has a sense of dependence on the higher power. Today 2 seals, a weddell and a crab-eater, came close to the camp and were shot. 4 others were chased back into the water, for their presence disturbed the dog teams, and this meant floggings and trouble with the harness. The arrangement of the tents has been complete, and the internal management settled. Each tent has a mess orderly, the duty being taken in turn on an alphabetical rota. The orderly takes the hoosh pots off his tent to the galley, gets all the hoosh he is allowed, and, after the meal, cleans the vessels with snow, and stores them in sledge or boat ready for a possible move. October 29th. We passed a quiet night, although the pressure was grinding around us. Our floe is a heavy one, and it withstood the blows it received. There is a light wind from the northwest to north-northwest, and the weather is fine. We are 28 men with 49 dogs, including Sue and Sally's 5 grown-up pups. All hands this morning were busy preparing gear, fitting boats on sledges, and building up and strengthening the sledges to carry the boats. The main motor sledge, with its little fitting from the carpenter, carried our largest boats admirably. For the next boat, 4 ordinary sledges were lashed together, but we were dubious as to the strength of this contrivance, and as a matter of fact it broke down quickly under strain. The ship is still afloat, with the spurs of the pack driven through her and holding her up. The forecastle head is under water, the docks are burst up by the pressure, the wreckage lies around in dismal confusion, but over all the blue ensign flies still. This afternoon Sally's 3 youngest pups, Sue Sirius, and Mrs. Chippy the carpenter's cat, have to be shot. We cannot undertake the maintenance of weaklings under the new conditions. Macklin, Crean, and the carpenter seem to feel the loss of their friends rather badly. We propose making a short trial journey tomorrow, starting with 2 of the boats and the 10 sledges. The number of dog teams has been increased to 7. Greenstreet taking charge of the new additional team, consisting of Snapper and Sally's 4 oldest pups. We have 10 working sledges to relay with 5 teams. Wild and Hurley's teams will haul the cutter with the assistance of 4 men. The whaler and the other boats will follow, and the men who are hauling them will be able to help with the cutter at rough places. We cannot hope to make rapid progress, but each mile counts. Crean this afternoon has a bad attack of snow blindness. The weather on the morning of October 30th was overcast and misty, with occasional falls of snow. A moderate northeasterly breeze was blowing. We were still living on extra food brought from the ship when we abandoned her, and the sledging and boating rations were intact. These rations would provide for 28 men for 56 days on full rations, but we could count on getting enough seal and penguin meat to at least double this time. We could even, if progress proved too difficult and too injurious to the boats, which we must guard as our ultimate means of salvation, camp on the nearest heavy floe, scour the neighbouring pack for penguins and seals, and await the outward drift of the pack to open and navigable water. This plan would avoid the grave dangers we are now incurring of getting entangled in impassable pressure ridges and possibly irretrievably damaging the boats, which are bound to suffer in rough ice. It would also minimise the peril of the ice splitting under us, as it did twice during the night of our first camp. Yet I feel sure that it is the right thing to attempt a march, since if we can make 5 or 7 miles a day to the northwest, our chance of reaching safety in the months to come will be increased greatly. There is a psychological aspect to the question also. It will be much better for the men in general to feel that, even though progress is slow, they are on their way to land, than it will be to simply sit down and wait for the tardy northwesterly drift to take us out of this cruel waste of ice. We will make an attempt to move. The issue is beyond my power either to predict or to control. That afternoon Wild and I went out in the mist and snow to find a road to the northeast. After many devious turnings to avoid the heavier pressure ridges, we pioneered away for at least 1.5 miles, and then returned by a rather better route to the camp. The pressure now was rapid in movement, and our floe was suffering from the shakes and jerks of the ice. At 3 p.m. after lunch, we got under way, leaving Dump Cap a mass of debris. The order was that personal gear must not exceed 2 pounds per man, and this meant that nothing but bare necessaries was to be taken on the march. We could not afford to cumber ourselves with unnecessary weight. Holes had been dug in the snow for the reception of private letters and little personal trifles. The lars and penates of the members of the expedition, and into the privacy of these white graves were consigned much of sentimental value, and not of little intrinsic worth. I rather grudged the 2 pounds allowance per man, owing to my keen anxiety to keep weights at a minimum, but some personal belongings could fairly be regarded as indispensable. The journey might be a long one, and there was a possibility of a winter in impoverished quarters on an inhospitable coast at the other end. A man under such conditions needs something to occupy his thoughts, some tangible memento of his home and people beyond the seas. So sovereigns were thrown away, and photographs were kept. I tore the fly-leaf out of the Bible that Queen Alexandra had given to the ship, with her own writing on it, and also the wonderful page of Job containing the verse, "Out of whose womb comes the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven who has gendered it. The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen." Job chapter 38, verses 29 to 30. The other Bible, which Queen Alexandra had given us for the use of the shore party, was down below in the lower hold in one of the cases when the ship received her death blow. Suitcases were thrown away. These were retrieved later as material for making boots, and some of them, marked "solid leather," proved, to our disappointment, to contain a large percentage of cardboard. The manufacturer would have had difficulty in convincing us at the time that the deception was anything short of criminal. The pioneer sledge party, consisting of Wordie, Hussey, Hudson, and myself, carrying picks and shovels, started to break a road through the pressure ridges for the sledges carrying the boats. The boats, with their gear and the sledges beneath them, weighed each more than a ton. The cutter was smaller than the whaler, but weighed more, and was a much more strongly built boat. The whaler was mounted on the sledge part of the Girling tractor forward, and 2 sledges amidships and aft. These sledges were strengthened with cross timbers and shortened oars fore and aft. The cutter was mounted on the aero sledge. The sledges were the point of weakness. It appeared almost hopeless to prevent them smashing under the heavy laden loads when travelling over rough pressure ice, which stretched ahead of us for probably 300 miles. After the pioneer sledge had started, the 7 dog teams got off. They took their sledges forward for half a mile, then went back for the other sledges. Worsley took charge of the 2 boats, with 15 men hauling, and these also had to be relayed. It was heavy work for dogs and men, but there were intervals of comparative rest on the backward journey, after the first portion of the load had been taken forward. We passed over 2 opening cracks, through which killers were pushing their ugly snouts, and by 5 p.m. had covered a mile in a north-northwesterly direction. The condition of the ice ahead was chaotic, for since the morning increased pressure had developed, and the pack was moving and crashing in all directions. So I gave the order to pitch camp for the night on flat ice, which unfortunately proved to be young and salty. The older pack was too rough and too deeply laden with snow to offer a suitable camping ground. Although we had gained only 1 mile in a direct line, the necessary deviations made the distance travelled at least 2 miles, and the relays brought the distance marched up to 6 miles. Some of the dog teams had covered at least 10 miles. I set the watch from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m., 1 hour for each man in each tent in rotation. During the night snow fell heavily, and the floor cloths of the tents got wet through, as the temperature had risen to plus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the things we hoped for in those days was a temperature in the neighbourhood of 0, for then the snow surface would be hard, we would not be troubled by damp, and our gear would not become covered in soft snow. The killers were blowing all night, and a crack appeared about 20 foot from the camp at 2 a.m. The ice below us was quite thin enough for the killers to break through, if they took a fancy to do so. But there was no other camping ground within our reach, and we had to take the risk. When morning came, the snow was falling so heavily that we could not see more than a few score yards ahead, and I decided not to strike camp. A path over the shattered floes would be hard to find, and to get the boats into a position of peril might be disastrous. Rickinson and Worsley started back for Dump Camp at 7 a.m. to get some wood and blubber for the fire, and an hour later we had hoosh with 1 biscuit each. At 10 a.m. Hurley and Hudson left for the old camp, in order to bring some additional dog pemmican, since there were no seals to be found near us. Then, as the weather cleared, Worsley and I made a prospect to the west, and tried to find a practicable road. A large floe offered a fairly good road for at least another mile to the northwest, and we went back prepared for another move. The weather cleared a little, and after lunch we struck camp. I took Rickinson, Kerr, Wordie and Hudson as a breakdown gang to pioneer a path among the pressure ridges. 5 dog teams followed. Wild's and Hurley's teams were hitched onto the cutter, and they started off in a splendid style. They needed to be helped only once. Indeed, 14 dogs did as well or even better than 18 men. The ice was moving beneath and around us as we worked towards the big floe, and where this floe met the smaller ones, there was a mass of pressed up ice still in motion, with water between the ridges. But it is wonderful what a dozen men can do with picks and shovels. We cut a road through a pressure ridge about 14 feet high in 10 minutes, and leave a smooth, or a comparatively smooth, path for the sledges and teams. End of Chapter 4, Part 2.
Chapter 5 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 5, Ocean Camp. In spite of the wet, deep snow and the halts occasioned by thus having to cut our road through the pressure ridges, we managed to march the best part of a mile towards our goal, though the relays and the deviations again made the actual distance travelled nearer 6 miles. As I could see that the men were all exhausted, I gave the order to pitch the tents under the lee of the 2 boats, which afforded some slight protection from the wet snow now threatening to cover everything. While so engaged, one of the sailors discovered a small pool of water, caused by the snow having thawed on a sail which was lying in one of the boats. There was not much, just a sip each, but as one man wrote in his diary, one has seen and tasted cleaner, but seldom more opportunely found water. Next day broke cold and still, with the same wet snow, and in the clearing light I could see that with the present loose surface, and considering how little result we had to show for all our strenuous efforts of the past 4 days, it would be impossible to proceed for any great distance. Taking into account also the possibility of leads opening close to us, and so of our being able to row northwest to where we might find land, I decided to find a more solid floe, and there camp until conditions were more favourable for us to make a second attempt to escape from our icy prison. To this end we moved our tents and all our gear to a thick, heavy old floe, about 1.5 miles from the wreck, and there made our camp. We called this Ocean Camp. It was with the utmost difficulty that we shifted our 2 boats. The surface was terrible, like nothing that any of us had ever seen around us before. We were sinking at times up to our hips, and everywhere the snow was 2 feet deep. I decided to conserve our valuable sledging rations, which would be so necessary for the inevitable boat journey, as much as possible, and to subsist almost entirely on seals and penguins. A party was sent back to Dump Camp, near the ship, to collect as much clothing, tobacco, etc. as they could find. The heavy snow which had fallen in the last few days, combined with the thawing and subsequent sinking of the surface, resulted in the total disappearance of a good many of the things left behind at this dump. The remainder of the men made themselves as comfortable as possible under the circumstances at Ocean Camp. This floating lump of ice, about 1 mile square at first, but later splitting into smaller and smaller fragments, was to be our home for nearly 2 months. During these 2 months we made frequent visits to the vicinity of the ship, and retrieved much valuable clothing and food, and some few articles of personal value, which in our light-hearted optimism we had thought to leave miles behind us on our dash across the moving ice to safety. The collection of food was now the all-important consideration. As we were to subsist almost entirely on seals and penguins, which were to provide fuel as well as food, some form of blubber stove was a necessity. This was eventually very ingeniously contrived from the ship's steel ash chute, as our first attempt with a large iron oil drum did not prove eminently successful. We could only cook seal or penguin hushes or stews on this stove, and so uncertain was its action that the food was either burnt or only partially cooked, and, hungry though we were, half-raw seal meat was not very appetizing. On one occasion, a wonderful stew made from seal meat, with 2 or 3 tins of Irish stew that had been salved from the ship, fell into the fire through the bottom of the oil drum that was used as a saucepan, becoming burnt out on account of the sudden intense heat of the fire below. We lunched that day on 1 biscuit and 1/4 of a tin of bully beef each, frozen hard. This new stove, which was to last us during our stay at Ocean Camp, was a great success. 2 large holes were punched, with much labour and few tools, opposite one another, at the wider or top end of the chute. Into one of these an oil drum was fixed, to be used as the fireplace, the other hole serving to hold our saucepan. Alongside this, another hole was punched to enable 2 saucepans to be boiled at a time, and further along still, a chimney made from biscuit tins completed a very efficient, if not a very elegant, stove. Later on, the cook found that he could bake a sort of flat bannock or scone on this stove, but he was seriously hampered for want of yeast or baking powder. An attempt was next made to erect some sort of a galley to protect the cook against the inclemencies of the weather. The party which I had sent back under Wild to the ship returned with, amongst other things, the wheelhouse practically complete. This, with the addition of some sails and tarpaulins stretched on spars, made a very comfortable storehouse and galley. Pieces of planking from the deck were lashed across some spars stuck upright into the snow, and this, with the ship's binnacle, formed an excellent lookout from which to look for seals and penguins. On this platform, too, a mast was erected from which flew the King's flag and the Royal Clyde Yacht Club burgee. I made a strict inventory of all the food in our possession, weights being roughly determined with a simple balance made from a piece of wood and some string, the counterbalance being a 60-pound box of provisions. The dog teams went off to the wreck early each morning under Wild, and the men made every effort to rescue as much as possible from the ship. This was an extremely difficult task, as the whole of the deck forward was under a foot of water on the port side, and nearly 3 feet on the starboard side. However, they managed to collect large quantities of wood and ropes, and some few cases of provisions. Although the galley was under water, Bakewell managed to secure 3 or 4 saucepans, which later proved invaluable acquisitions. Quite a number of boxes of flour, etc., had been stowed in a cabin in the hold, and these we had been unable to get out before we left the ship. Having therefore determined as nearly as possible that portion of the deck immediately above these cases, we proceeded to cut a hole with large ice chisels through the 3-inch planking of which it was formed. As the ship at this spot was under 5 feet of water and ice, it was not an easy job. However, we succeeded in making the hole sufficiently large to allow of some few cases to come floating up. These were greeted with great satisfaction, and later on, as we warmed to our work, other cases whose upward progress was assisted with a boat hook were greeted with either cheers or groans, according to whether they contained farinaceous food or merely luxuries such as jellies. For each man by now had a good idea of the calorific value and nutritive and sustaining qualities of the various foods. It had a personal interest for us all. In this way we added to our scanty stock between 2 and 3 tons of provisions, about half of which was farinaceous food such as flour and peas, of which we were so short. This sounds a great deal, but at £1 per day it would only last 28 men for 3 months. Previous to this I had reduced the food allowance to 9½ ounces per man per day. Now, however, it could be increased, and this afternoon, for the first time for 10 days, we knew what it was to be really satisfied. I had the sledges packed, in readiness with the special sledging rations in case of a sudden move, and with the other food, allowing also for prospective seals and penguins, I calculated a dietary to give the utmost possible variety and yet to use our precious stock of flour in the most economical manner. All seals and penguins that appeared anywhere within the vicinity of the camp were killed to provide food and fuel. The dog pemmican we also added to our own larder, feeding the dogs on the seals which we caught, after removing such portions as were necessary for our own needs. We were rather short of crockery, but small pieces of venesta wood served admirably as plates for seal steaks. Stews and liquids of all sorts were served in the aluminium sledging mugs, of which each man had 1. Later on, jelly tins and biscuit tin lids were pressed into service. Monotony in the meals, even considering the circumstances in which we found ourselves, was what I was striving to avoid, so our little stock of luxuries, such as fish paste, tinned herrings, etc., was carefully husbanded, and so distributed as to last as long as possible. My efforts were not in vain, as one man states in his diary, quote, "It must be admitted that we are feeding very well indeed, considering our position. Each meal consists of 1 course and a beverage. The dried vegetables, if any, all go into the same pot as the meat, and every dish is a sort of hash or stew, be it ham or seal meat, or half and half. The fact that we only have 2 pots available places restrictions upon the number of things that can be cooked at one time, but in spite of the limitation of facilities, we always seem to manage to get just enough. The milk powder and sugar are necessarily boiled with the tea or coffee. We are, of course, very short of the farinaceous element in our diet, and consequently have a mild craving for more of it. Bread is out of the question, and as we are husbanding the remaining cases of our biscuits for our prospective boat journey, we are eking out the supply of flour by making bannocks, of which we have from 3 to 4 each day. These bannocks are made from flour, fat, water, salt, and a little baking powder, the dough being rolled out into flat rounds and baked in about 10 minutes on a hot sheet of iron over the fire. Each bannock weighs about 1½ to 2 ounces, and we are indeed lucky to be able to produce them." Unquote. A few boxes of army biscuits soaked with seawater were distributed at one meal. They were in such a state that they would not have been looked at a second time under ordinary circumstances, but to us, on a floating lump of ice over 300 miles from land, and that quite hypothetical, and with the unplumbed sea beneath us, they were luxuries indeed. Wild's tent made a pudding of theirs with some dripping. Although keeping in mind the necessity for strict economy with our scanty store of food, I knew how important it was to keep the men cheerful, and that the depression occasioned by our surroundings and our precarious position could to some extent be alleviated by increasing the rations, at least until we were more accustomed to our new mode of life. That this was successful is shown in their diaries. Quote, "Day by day goes by much the same as one another. We work, we talk, we eat. Ah, how we eat! No longer on short rations, we are a trifle more exacting than we were when we first commenced our simple life, but by comparison with home standards we are positive barbarians, and our gastronomic rapacity knows no bounds. All is eaten that comes to each tent, and everything is most carefully and accurately divided into as many equal portions as there are men in the tent. One member then closes his eyes, or turns his head away, and calls out the names at random, as the cook for the day points to each portion, saying at the same time, 'Whose?' Partiality, however unintentional it may be, is thus entirely obviated, and everyone feels satisfied that all is fair, even though one may look a little enviously at the next man's helping, which differs in some especially appreciated detail from one's own. We break the 10th commandment energetically, but as we are all in the same boat in this respect, no one says a word. We understand each other's feelings quite sympathetically. It is just like school days over again, and very jolly it is too, for the time being." Unquote. Later on, as the prospect of wintering in the pack became more apparent, the rations had to be considerably reduced. By that time, however, everybody had become more accustomed to the idea, and took it quite as a matter of course. Our meals now consisted in the main of a fairly generous helping of seal or penguin, either boiled or fried. As one man wrote, quote, "We are now having enough to eat, but not by any means too much, and everyone is always hungry enough to eat every scrap he can get. Meals are invariably taken very seriously, and little talking is done till the hoosh is finished." Unquote. Our tents made somewhat cramped quarters, especially during meal times. Quote, "Living in a tent without any furniture requires a little getting used to. For our meals we have to sit on the floor, and it is surprising how awkward it is to sit in such a position. It is better by far to kneel and sit back on one's heels, as do the Japanese." Unquote. Each man took it in turn to be the tent cook for one day, and one writes, quote, "The word cook is at present rather a misnomer, for whilst we have a permanent galley, no cooking need be done in the tent. Really, all that the tent cook has to do is to take his 2 hoosh pots over to the galley and convey the hoosh and the beverage to the tent, clearing up after each meal and washing up the 2 pots and the mugs. There are no spoons, etc. to wash, for we each keep our own spoon and pocket knife in our pockets. We just lick them as clean as possible and replace them in our pockets after each meal. Our spoons are one of our indispensable possessions here. To lose one's spoon would be almost as serious as it is for an edentate person to lose his set of false teeth." Unquote. During all this time, the supply of seals and penguins, if not inexhaustible, was always sufficient for our needs. Seal and penguin hunting was our daily occupation, and parties were sent out in different directions to search among the hummocks and the pressure ridges for them. When one was found, a signal was hoisted, usually in the form of a scarf or a sock on a pole, and an answering signal was hoisted at the camp. Then Wild went out with a dog team to shoot and bring in the game. To feed ourselves and the dogs, at least 1 seal a day was required. The seals were mostly crab-eaters, and emperor penguins were the general rule. On November the 5th, however, an adelie was caught, and this was the cause of much discussion, as the following extract shows. Quote, "The man on watch from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. caught an adelie penguin. This is the first of its kind that we have seen since January last, and it may mean a lot. It may signify that there is land somewhere near us, or else that great leads are opening up, but it is impossible to form more than a mere conjecture at present." Unquote. No skuas, Antarctic petrels or sea leopards were seen during our 2-month stay at Ocean Camp. In addition to the daily hunt for food, our time was passed in reading the few books that we had managed to save from the ship. The greatest treasure in the library was a portion of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. This was being continually used to settle the inevitable arguments that would arise. The sailors were discovered one day engaged in a very heated discussion on the subject of money and exchange. They finally came to the conclusion that the encyclopedia, since it did not coincide with their views, must be wrong. Quote, "For descriptions of every American town that ever has been, is, or ever will be, and for full and complete biographies of every American statesman since the time of George Washington and long before, the encyclopedia would be hard to beat. Owing to our shortage of matches, we have been driven to use it for purposes other than the purely literary ones, though, and one genius, having discovered that the paper used for its pages had been impregnated with saltpeter, we can now thoroughly recommend it as a very efficient pipe lighter." Unquote. We also possessed a few books on Antarctic exploration, a copy of Browning, and one of The Ancient Mariner. On reading the latter, we sympathized with him and wondered what he had done with the albatross. It would have made a very welcome addition to our larder. The two subjects of most interest to us were our rate of drift and the weather. Worsley took observations of the sun whenever possible, and his results showed conclusively that the drift of our floe was almost entirely dependent upon the winds, and not much affected by currents. Our hope, of course, was to drift northwards to the edge of the pack, and then, when the ice was loose enough, to take to the boats and row to the nearest land. We started off in fine style, drifting north about 20 miles in 2 or 3 days in a howling southwesterly blizzard. Gradually, though, we slowed up, as successive observations showed, until we began to drift back to the south. An increasing northeasterly wind, which commenced on November the 7th and lasted for 12 days, damped our spirits for a time, until we found that we had only drifted back to the south 3 miles, so that we were now 17 miles to the good. This tended to reassure us in our theories that the ice of the Weddell Sea was drifting round in a clockwise direction, and that if we could stay on our piece long enough, we must eventually be taken up to the north, where lay the open sea and the path to comparative safety. The ice was not moving fast enough to be noticeable. In fact, the only way in which we could prove that we were moving at all was by noting the change of relative positions of the bergs around us, and, more definitely, by fixing our absolute latitude and longitude by observations of the sun. Otherwise, as far as actual visible drift was concerned, we might have been on dry land. For the next few days we made good progress, drifting 7 miles to the north on November the 24th, and another 7 miles in the next 48 hours. We were all very pleased to know that although the wind was mainly southwest all this time, yet we had made very little easting. The land lay to the west, so had we drifted to the east, we should have been taken right away to the centre of the entrance to the Weddell Sea, and our chances of finally reaching land would have been considerably lessened. Our average rate of drift was slow, and many and varied were the calculations as to when we should reach the pack edge. On December the 12th, 1915, one man wrote, quote, "Once across the Antarctic Circle, it would seem as if we are practically halfway home again, and it is just possible that with favourable winds we may cross the circle before the new year. A drift of only 3 miles a day would do it, and we have often done that and more for periods of 3 or 4 weeks. We are now only 250 miles from Paulet Island, but too much to the east of it. We are approaching the latitudes in which we were at this time last year on our way down. The ship left South Georgia just a year and a week ago, and reached this latitude 4 or 5 miles to the eastward of our present position on January the 3rd, 1915, crossing the circle on New Year's Eve." Unquote. Thus, after a year's incessant battle with the ice, we had returned, by many strange turns of fortune's wheel, to almost identically the same latitude that we had left with such high hopes and aspirations 12 months previously. But under what different conditions now! Our ship crushed and lost, and we ourselves drifting on a piece of ice at the mercy of the winds. However, in spite of occasional setbacks due to unfavourable winds, our drift was in the main very satisfactory, and this went a long way towards keeping the men cheerful. As the drift was mostly affected by the winds, the weather was closely watched by all, and Hussey, the meteorologist, was called upon to make forecasts every 4 hours, and sometimes more frequently than that. A meteorological screen containing thermometers and a barograph had been erected on a post frozen into the ice, and observations were taken every 4 hours. When we first left the ship, the weather was cold and miserable, and altogether as unpropitious as it could possibly have been for our attempted march. Our first few days at Ocean Camp were passed under much the same conditions. At nights the temperature dropped to 0, with blinding snow and drift. 1-hour watches were instituted, all hands taking their turn, and in such weather this job was no sinecure. The watchman had to be continually on the alert for cracks in the ice or any sudden changes in the ice conditions, and also had to keep his eye on the dogs, who often became restless, fretful, and quarrelsome in the early hours of the morning. At the end of his hour he was very glad to crawl back into the comparative warmth of his frozen sleeping bag. On November the 6th, a dull, overcast day developed into a howling blizzard from the southwest, with snow and low drift. Only those who were compelled left the shelter of their tent. Deep drifts formed everywhere, burying sledges and provisions to a depth of 2 feet, and the snow piling up around the tents threatened to burst the thin fabric. The fine drift found its way in through the ventilator of the tent, which was accordingly plugged up with a spare sock. This lasted for 2 days, when one man wrote, quote, "The blizzard continued through the morning, but cleared towards noon, and it was a beautiful evening, but we would far rather have the screeching blizzard and its searching drift and cold damp wind, for we drifted about 11 miles to the north during the night." Unquote. For 4 days the fine weather continued, with gloriously warm, bright sun, but cold when standing still or in the shade. The temperature usually dropped below 0, but every opportunity was taken during these fine sunny days to partially dry our sleeping bags and other gear, which had become sodden through our body heat, having thawed the snow which had drifted in onto them during the blizzard. The bright sun seemed to put new heart into all. The next day brought a northeasterly wind, with the very high temperature of 27 degrees Fahrenheit, only 5 degrees below freezing. Quote, "These high temperatures do not always represent the warmth which might be assumed from the thermometrical readings. They usually bring dull, overcast skies with a raw, muggy, moisture-laden wind. The winds from the south, though colder, are nearly always coincident with sunny days and clear blue skies." Unquote. The temperature still continued to rise, reaching 33 degrees Fahrenheit on November the 14th. The thaw consequent upon these high temperatures was having a disastrous effect upon the surface of our camp. Quote, "The surface is awful, not slushy, but elusive. You step out gingerly. All is well for a few paces, then your foot suddenly sinks a couple of feet until it comes to a hard layer. You wade along in this way step by step, like a mudlark at Portsmouth Hard, hoping gradually to regain the surface. Soon you do, only to repeat the exasperating performance ad lib, to the accompaniment of all the expletives that you can bring to bear on the subject. What actually happens is that the warm air melts the surface sufficiently to cause drops of water to trickle down slightly, where, on meeting colder layers of snow, they freeze again, forming a honeycomb of icy nodules instead of the soft, powdery, granular snow that we are accustomed to." Unquote. These high temperatures persisted for some days, and when, as occasionally happened, the sky was clear and the sun was shining, it was unbearably hot. 5 men who were sent to fetch some gear from the vicinity of the ship with a sledge marched in nothing but trousers and singlet, and even then they were very hot. In fact, they were afraid of getting sunstroke, so let down flaps from their caps to cover their necks. Their sleeves were rolled up over their elbows, and their arms were red and sunburnt in consequence. The temperature on this occasion was 26 degrees Fahrenheit, or 6 degrees below freezing. For 5 or 6 days more the sun continued, and most of our clothes and sleeping bags were now comparatively dry. A wretched day, with rainy sleet, set in on November the 21st, but one could put up with this discomfort, as the wind was now from the south. The wind veered later to the west, and the sun came out at 9 p.m, for at this time, near the end of November, we had the midnight sun. A thrice-blessed southerly wind soon arrived to cheer us all, occasioning the following remarks in one of the diaries. Quote, "Today is the most beautiful day we have had in the Antarctic. A clear sky, a gentle, warm breeze from the south, and the most brilliant sunshine. We all took advantage of it to strike tents, clean out, and generally dry and air ground sheets and sleeping bags." Unquote. I was up early, 4 a.m, to keep watch, and the sight was indeed magnificent. Spread out before one was an extensive panorama of ice fields, intersected here and there by small broken leads, and dotted with numerous noble bergs, partly bathed in sunshine and partly tinged with the grey shadows of an overcast sky. As one watched, one observed a distinct line of demarcation between the sunshine and the shade, and this line gradually approached nearer and nearer, lighting up the hummocky relief of the ice field bit by bit, until at last it reached us and threw the whole camp into a blaze of glorious sunshine which lasted nearly all day. Quote, "This afternoon we were treated to 1 or 2 showers of hail-like snow. Yesterday we also had a rare form of snow, or rather precipitation of ice spicules, exactly like little hairs, about 1/3 of an inch long. The warmth in the tents at lunchtime was so great that we had all the side flaps up for ventilation, but it is a treat to get warm occasionally, and one can put up with a little stuffy atmosphere now and again for the sake of it. The wind has gone to the best quarter this evening, the southeast, and is refreshing." Unquote. On these fine, clear, sunny days, wonderful mirage effects could be observed, just as occur over the desert. Huge bergs were apparently resting on nothing, with a distinct gap between their bases and the horizon. Others were curiously distorted into all sorts of weird and fantastic shapes, appearing to be many times their proper height. Added to this, the pure glistening white of the snow and ice made a picture which it is impossible adequately to describe. Later on, the refreshing southwesterly wind brought mild, overcast weather, probably due to the opening up of the pack in that direction. I had already made arrangements for a quick move in case of a sudden break-up of the ice. Emergency orders were issued, each man had his post allotted and his duty detailed, and the whole was so organised that in less than 5 minutes from the sounding of the alarm on my whistle, tents were struck, gear and provisions packed, and the whole party was ready to move off. I now took a final survey of the men to note their condition, both mental and physical, for our time at Ocean Camp had not been one of unalloyed bliss. The loss of the ship meant more to us than we could ever put into words. After we had settled at Ocean Camp, she still remained nipped by the ice, only her stern showing and her bows overridden and buried by the relentless pack. The tangled mass of ropes, rigging and spars made the scene even more desolate and depressing. It was with a feeling almost of relief that the end came. Quote, November the 21st, 1915. This evening, as we were lying in our tents, we heard the boss call out, "She's going, boys!" We were out in a second, and up on the lookout station and other points of vantage, and sure enough, there was our poor ship, 1.5 miles away, struggling in her death agony. She went down bows first, her stern raised in the air. She then gave one quick dive, and the ice closed over her forever. It gave one a sickening sensation to see it, for, maskless and useless as she was, she seemed to be a link with the outer world. Without her, our destitution seems more emphasized, our desolation more complete. The loss of the ship sent a slight wave of depression over the camp. No one said much, but we cannot be blamed for feeling it in a sentimental way. It seemed as if the moment of severance from many cherished associations, many happy moments, even stirring incidents, had come, as she silently upended to find a last resting place beneath the ice on which we now stand. When one knows every little nook and corner of one's ship, as we did, and has helped her time and again in the fight that she made so well, the actual parting was not without its pathos, quite apart from one's own desolation, and I doubt if there was one amongst us who did not feel some personal emotion when Sir Ernest, standing on the top of the lookout, said, somewhat sadly and quietly, "She's gone, boys." It must, however, be said that we did not give way to depression for long, for soon everyone was as cheery as usual. Laughter rang out from the tents, and even the boss had a passage at arms with the storekeeper over the inadequacy of the sausage ration, insisting that there should be 2 each, because they were such little ones, instead of the 1.5 that the latter proposed. Unquote. The psychological effect of a slight increase in the rations soon neutralized any tendency to downheartedness, but with the high temperatures, surface thaw set in, and our bags and clothes were soaked and sodden. Our boots squelched as we walked, and we lived in a state of perpetual wet feet. At nights, before the temperature had fallen, clouds of steam could be seen rising from our soaking bags and boots. During the night, as it grew colder, this all condensed as rime on the inside of the tent, and showered down on us if one happened to touch the side inadvertently. One had to be careful how one walked, too, as often only a thin crust of ice and snow covered a hole in the floe, through which many an unwary member went in up to his waist. These perpetual soakings, however, seemed to have had little lasting effect, or perhaps it was not apparent, owing to the excitement of the prospect of an early release. A northwesterly wind, on December the 7th and 8th, retarded our progress somewhat, but I had reason to believe that it would help to open the ice and form leads through which we might escape to open water. So I ordered a practice launching of the boats and stowage of food and stores in them. This was very satisfactory. We cut a slipway from our floe into a lead which ran alongside, and the boats took the water like a bird, as one sailor remarked. Our hopes were high in anticipation of an early release. A blizzard sprang up, increasing the next day and burying tents and packing cases in the drift. On December the 12th it had moderated somewhat and veered to the southeast, and the next day the blizzard had ceased, but a good steady wind from south and southwest continued to blow us north. Quote, December the 15th, 1915. The continuance of southerly winds is exceeding our best hopes, and raising our spirits in proportion. Prospects could not be brighter than they are just now. The environs of our floe are continually changing. Some days we are almost surrounded by small open leads, preventing us from crossing over to the adjacent floes. Unquote. After 2 more days our fortune changed, and a strong northeasterly wind brought a beastly cold, windy day, and drove us back 3¼ miles. Soon, however, the wind once more veered to the south and southwest. These high temperatures, combined with the strong changeable winds that we'd had of late, led me to conclude that the ice all around us was rotting and breaking up, and that the moment of our deliverance from the icy maw of the Antarctic was at hand. On December the 20th, after discussing the question with Wild, I informed all hands that I intended to try and make a march to the west to reduce the distance between us and Paulet Island. A buzz of pleasurable anticipation went round the camp, and everyone was anxious to get on the move, so the next day I set off with Wild, Crean and Hurley, with dog teams, to the westward to survey the route. After travelling about 7 miles, we mounted a small berg, and there, as far as we could see, stretched a series of immense flat floes from 1/2 mile to 1 mile across, separated from each other by pressure ridges, which seemed easily negotiable with pick and shovel. The only place that appeared likely to be formidable was a very much cracked up area between the old floe that we were on and the first of the series of young flat floes about 1/2 mile away. December the 22nd was therefore kept as Christmas Day, and most of our small remaining stock of luxuries was consumed at the Christmas feast. We could not carry it all with us, so for the last time for 8 months we had a really good meal, as much as we could eat. Anchovies in oil, baked beans, and jugged hare made a glorious mixture such as we have not dreamed of since our school days. Everybody was working at high pressure, packing and repacking sledges and stowing what provisions we were going to take with us in the various sacks and boxes. As I looked around at the eager faces of the men, I could not but hope that this time the fates would be kinder to us than in our last attempt to march across the ice to safety. End of chapter 5.